In this episode, we're going to take a step back from individual controls and look at the bigger picture of how an organization protects itself, because it is surprisingly common to have many controls and still have serious blind spots. A control portfolio is the whole set of safeguards an organization uses across people, process, and technology, and the portfolio matters because risks do not arrive in neat single-file lines. Some risks slip through because no control covers a critical point in the path to harm, while other risks are addressed repeatedly by overlapping controls that create workload without improving outcomes. When you learn to evaluate coverage, gaps, and overlap, you gain a practical skill. You can explain whether the organization is protected in the places that matter most, and you can also explain where effort is being wasted. That skill is especially valuable because it supports smarter decisions about what to improve, what to simplify, and what to monitor more closely over time. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyber.author.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. A useful way to begin is to clarify what control coverage actually means, because beginners often confuse coverage with control count. Coverage is not how many controls you have. Coverage is whether the controls you have meaningfully reduce risk for the scenarios you care about. Imagine a home with 10 locks on one door and no lock on the back door, and you immediately see why count is not the same as coverage. In cybersecurity and operational risk, the same pattern happens when teams invest heavily in one category of protection, like policies or monitoring, while leaving other categories underprotected, like recovery readiness or access governance. Coverage also has a quality dimension, because a control that exists but rarely works is not truly covering anything in practice. Evaluating coverage means looking at whether controls are present, whether they are effective, and whether they are placed where they can influence real outcomes. Once coverage is defined clearly, you can start thinking of the portfolio as a map, where risks are the destinations you want to avoid and controls are the roads that steer you away from them. The first part of this map is understanding which risks matter most, because you cannot judge coverage without knowing what you are trying to cover. That includes high-impact outcomes like extended downtime, sensitive data exposure, and loss of integrity in critical processes, but it also includes recurring operational failures that create constant disruption. Beginners sometimes treat all risks as equal, but in a portfolio view you weigh risks by impact, dependency, and tolerance, which keeps the evaluation focused on what would truly hurt the organization. With that risk context in mind, you can ask whether the portfolio's controls form a coherent set that prevents, detects, and corrects the most important scenarios, rather than a random collection built over time. A strong portfolio evaluation also recognizes that controls operate in layers, and layered protection is not automatically wasteful. When people talk about overlap, they sometimes assume overlap is always bad, but overlap can be valuable when it creates resilience, meaning one control still protects you when another fails. For example, if a preventive control is bypassed, a detective control might still catch the problem early, and a corrective control might still limit damage and speed recovery. That is healthy overlap, because it reduces the chance that a single failure becomes a catastrophe. Wasteful overlap is different because it happens when multiple controls perform the same function in the same way, rely on the same weak assumptions, or require the same manual work without adding a different kind of protection. Evaluating overlap therefore requires you to look at how controls differ in purpose, timing, and failure modes, not just whether two controls address the same area. To evaluate coverage properly, you need to decide what dimensions of coverage you care about, and those dimensions should match how harm actually occurs. One important dimension is the stage of an adverse event, meaning whether controls are aimed at prevention, detection, or correction. Another dimension is the scope of what the control influences, such as a single system, a family of systems, or an entire business process. A third dimension is the type of control, such as procedural controls, technical controls, and governance controls, recognizing that each type has strengths and weaknesses. There is also a human dimension, because some controls depend heavily on people doing the right thing consistently, which can be fragile during stress. When you consider these dimensions, you can see whether the portfolio leans too heavily on one kind of protection, like rules, while lacking another kind, like validated recovery. This dimensional thinking helps beginners avoid shallow conclusions like we have policies, so we are covered. Gaps are the most urgent outcome of portfolio evaluation, but it is important to define what a gap really is. A gap is not simply an area where you would like more controls. It is a place where risk remains above tolerance because the portfolio lacks an effective control that addresses a key part of a risk scenario. A gap can be a missing control, like no reliable way to recover a critical service, but it can also be an ineffective control, like monitoring that produces noise but fails to detect meaningful events. A gap can also be a coverage mismatch, where controls exist but do not apply to a portion of the environment, such as a subset of assets that fell outside a standard process. Beginners often imagine gaps as technical problems, but many gaps are governance problems, like unclear ownership, inconsistent classification, or weak exception management. Seeing gaps as portfolio problems rather than isolated failures is what lets you fix them in ways that last. As you assess gaps, one of the most revealing questions is whether controls cover the full life cycle of an asset or process, because risk often enters during transitions. Assets are introduced, changed, integrated, and eventually retired, and each stage can create exposure if controls do not follow. A portfolio with strong onboarding controls but weak change oversight may appear safe at first and then become risky as systems evolve. A portfolio with strong production controls but weak retirement controls can leave orphaned data, forgotten accounts, or legacy services running quietly in the background. A portfolio with strong access controls but weak monitoring and response can still be vulnerable because misuse may go undetected until damage is done. Evaluating lifecycle coverage helps you find gaps that only appear over time, which is exactly when organizations tend to be surprised. For beginners, this teaches a crucial lesson. Control portfolios must keep pace with change, not just with the initial design of systems. Overlap, when evaluated well, often reveals opportunities to reduce complexity without reducing safety, which is an important goal because complexity is itself a risk factor. Multiple overlapping approval steps can slow work and encourage bypass, while still failing to catch the most important issues if the underlying inputs are poor. Multiple overlapping monitoring tools can flood teams with alerts, making it less likely that anyone notices the signal that matters. Multiple overlapping policies can create confusion about which rule applies, leading to inconsistent behavior and weak accountability. A mature portfolio evaluation asks whether overlap increases resilience or increases friction, and it uses evidence, like operational performance and incident patterns, to answer that question. Beginners should recognize that reducing unnecessary overlap is not about cutting corners. It is about strengthening effectiveness by making controls clearer, more operable, and more consistently followed. A portfolio view also helps you see control concentration, which is a different but related issue from overlap. Control concentration occurs when too much protection depends on a single mechanism, a single team, or a single point of decision, so that failure of that mechanism creates broad exposure. For example, if only one team understands how to operate a critical control, turnover or burnout can degrade effectiveness quickly. If all control evidence depends on a single data source that is incomplete, you may believe coverage exists when it does not. If a single approval group becomes a bottleneck, the organization may route around it informally, reducing operating effectiveness. Concentration is dangerous because it creates brittle protection, where the portfolio looks strong until a single weak link breaks. Evaluating concentration encourages resilience by spreading protection across different methods and different points of failure, which is a practical way to reduce systemic risk. Another important part of portfolio evaluation is aligning control coverage with risk tolerance, because not every area deserves the same intensity of control. If an organization has low tolerance for certain outcomes, like exposure of highly sensitive data or extended outage of a critical service, then the portfolio should show strong coverage in those areas with layered controls and strong evidence. If an organization has higher tolerance for low-impact internal inconvenience, then it may accept lighter controls there, focusing on efficiency and basic hygiene. Misalignment shows up when high-risk areas have weak coverage while low-risk areas have heavy, burdensome controls, often due to historical accidents or uneven attention. Beginners sometimes assume more control is always better, but portfolio thinking teaches that smart control is proportional control. Proportional control improves both security and operations by putting attention where it buys down the most risk. To make portfolio evaluation defensible, you need a way to connect controls back to risk scenarios, because without that connection, you cannot explain why a control exists or why a gap matters. This is where scenario mapping is useful. You identify the points in a scenario where prevention could stop the event, detection could limit duration, and correction could reduce impact. You then ask which controls cover each point, whether those controls are effective, and whether evidence supports that effectiveness. This approach makes gaps visible as uncovered points in the scenario, and it makes overlap visible as multiple controls covering the same point in similar ways. It also supports control improvement because it highlights where a new control would change the risk path rather than just add another layer of paperwork. For beginners, mapping is less about drawing diagrams and more about disciplined reasoning that links risk, control, and outcome. Evidence plays a central role in evaluating coverage and overlap because the portfolio must be judged by what it actually does, not by what it claims to do. If you are evaluating whether detective coverage is strong, you look for evidence that meaningful events are detected and acted upon quickly, not just that monitoring exists. If you are evaluating whether corrective coverage is strong, you look for evidence that recovery works within tolerances, not just that plans exist. If you are evaluating preventive coverage, you look for evidence that risky actions are consistently blocked or require approval, not just that rules are written. Evidence can also reveal that overlap is only apparent, because two controls may exist, but neither operates reliably, leaving a gap disguised as redundancy. Beginners should see evidence as the organizing principle that keeps portfolio evaluation honest, because it replaces assumptions with observed performance. Portfolio evaluation also benefits from looking at patterns across time, because gaps and overlap often become obvious only when you examine repeated outcomes. If the same type of incident happens repeatedly, it suggests a gap in control coverage for that scenario, even if many controls exist elsewhere. If teams repeatedly complain that a process is slow and still fails to prevent known issues, it suggests overlap that creates friction without effectiveness. If controls perform well during quiet periods but fail during busy periods, it suggests that operating effectiveness depends too heavily on human effort without adequate support. Trends also reveal whether improvements are working, because a portfolio should become more effective over time, not just more complex. For beginners, the key point is that the portfolio is a living system, and you evaluate it by watching how it behaves, not by admiring how it is described. When you find gaps or wasteful overlap, the next question is how to respond in a way that improves the portfolio instead of creating more clutter. A good response prioritizes closing gaps that affect high-impact outcomes, especially where risk is outside tolerance and evidence shows controls are failing or absent. It also prioritizes simplifying overlap that increases friction because reduced friction often improves compliance and operating effectiveness. Sometimes the best improvement is not adding a new control, but improving the reliability of an existing one, such as clarifying ownership, tightening evidence collection, or making the process fit normal work patterns. Other times, a compensating control can address a gap temporarily, while a longer-term fix is designed. But the compensating control must be tracked and reviewed so it does not become permanent by accident. Beginners should recognize that portfolio improvements should be deliberate and measured, because uncontrolled addition of controls is one way portfolios become unmanageable. To conclude, evaluating control coverage, gaps, and overlap across the control portfolio is the practice of ensuring the organization's safeguards form a coherent, effective system rather than a scattered collection of requirements. Coverage means the portfolio actually reduces risk for the scenarios that matter, and it must be evaluated across prevention, detection, and correction, across lifecycle stages, and across different types of controls. Gaps are uncovered or ineffective areas that leave risk above tolerance, while overlap can be either healthy resilience or wasteful duplication. depending on whether it adds protection or merely adds friction. Evidence and observed outcomes make portfolio evaluation defensible because they show what controls do in practice rather than what documents claim. When you can explain where the portfolio is strong, where it is weak, and where it is unnecessarily heavy, you provide the organization with a clear path to improve risk posture and operational performance at the same time. That ability to see the whole system and to improve it thoughtfully is the core skill this topic is trying to build.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.